Good day. We are on February 10, 2014. My name is Claude Bouchard, and I'm a professor at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center of the Louisiana State University system. I am also a long-standing member of the American Physiological Society. Today, I have the pleasure and honor of interviewing Dr. George A. Bray, MD, for the American Physiological Society's Living History Project. The interview is being recorded in the Pennington Biomedical Research Foundation in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Dr. Bray has been a member of the American Physiological Society for decades. He has had a very distinguished career in the science and also as a manager, and has contributed in many ways to clinical physiology, endocrinology, and internal medicine. In this interview, we will explore the various phases of Dr. Bray's career and contribution. George, welcome to the Living History Project, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed.
Claude, it's a pleasure to be here, and I can't think of anybody I would rather have interview me than you.
Well, thank you. We will divide the interview into three parts. First, your formative years. The second period, when you went from the East Coast to Los Angeles. And then the last couple of decades here at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center.
Sounds fair enough.
So let's begin with the formative years. So tell us about the circumstances of your upbringing.
Yeah, that formative years took a long time. I must have been a slow learner. I was born and raised in a community outside of Chicago, which was upper middle class, I guess you'd say, and it was a place where your options were largely to be a lawyer or a doctor, or maybe an airline pilot or an accountant or a professor. There were almost no blue-collar workers. It was those were the expectations, and in my high school class, 95% went on to college. They went to Dartmouth, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, and other places. So that was the sort of environment from which I came. And it closed a lot of doors, if you like, but also left a lot of professional options open. And I think the famous saying of Yogi Berra was, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And the first fork in the road came along when I selected a college education. That makes a number of important events in life. In those days, there were three that were on the list: Stanford, Harvard, and Brown. I was accepted at all and got scholarships to all. So the question was, where do you go? In those days, you didn't visit these schools. I had never seen any one of the schools, so there was no impression I had. There were no students I'd met that had gone to any of these places. And I was a little lost as to know which one to select. I went to the dean of my high school, who had been to Harvard, got his Doctor of Education there. And he asked me what I wanted to do, and I'm not quite sure how I knew where the answer came from, but I said I wanted to go to Harvard Medical School. It seems a little precocious for me, being a senior in high school. He said, you don't want to spend 8 years in Boston, so I suggest you go to Brown, which is what I did do. So with that in mind, I started my 4 years at Brown, and the second 4 years at Harvard were just sort of straight on down the line, not much in the way of choices. So the next fork in the road for me, this one which I took, had to do with where you go after medical school, because it's only 4 years and you've got to do something. And the internship was what you did. And I knew, sort of like growing up in my community when I was a kid, you could be a surgeon, or you could be an eye doctor, or you could be an internal medicine doctor, you could be a pediatrician. And we tried all of those during medical school, and I closed most of those as I didn't want to be a surgeon, I didn't want to be a pathologist, but internal medicine was where I thought I would be. And in medical school you have options, you can take electives of things. So I selected 3 different ones. I took endocrinology, pulmonary disease, and kidney disease. Those were my choices. And liked all 3 of them very much. But I think I realized that I was not likely to be able to make an academic career in Boston because all the professors, not all, but many of them were independently wealthy. And being an independently wealthy academic is a lot better than being one who has to earn a living, as we all know. And so I decided that the best thing to do was select an internship outside of Boston. So I put my Boston choices lower on the list and ended up at what I think was an absolutely wonderful choice. I had actually visited it before I went there, and that was Johns Hopkins, where I was an intern and where the spirit of Sir William Osler still walked the halls. His interest in history, his humanities, and it opened up some doors in the field that I had not seen previously. So it was a wonderfully broadening experience, and I'd already planned to go to NIH after that, excuse me, which I did. And my choice at NIH was either endocrinology or renal physiology, which is the 2 choices I had back in medical school. And I elected to go to work with a brilliant man, Robert Berliner, who was a renal physiologist, head of the Heart Institute and then NIH eventually. He's a superb individual. And then dean of the Yale Medical School. And it was that time that my interest in physiology began. It was when we developed something that was a way of counting radioactive solutions in water, something called Bray's solution, interestingly, and some work on concentration, meaning active transport of urea in the kidney. Those are the 2 major contributions. But while I was working there, I met Rosalind Pitt Rivers, who was my second important mentor. And she and a man named Gross had discovered triiodothyronine just a few years earlier. And I asked her if I could come spend a year in her laboratory at Mill Hill in London when I finished my residency training, and she said yes. So I went and did my residency training at Rochester, then went to London for a year doing endocrinology in the thyroid. So I wasn't really an endocrinologist and I wasn't a nephrologist. I was just sort of somewhere in between. And the next sort of fork was, where do you go for your fellowship training? And I pretty much decided I would prefer to do endocrinology than renal disease. So I went to work with the 3rd of my very important mentors, Ted Astwood at New England Medical Center. He was one of those gentle, brilliant men. All 3 of these mentors were brilliant people, all in their individual ways, and all had important impacts on my career. But it was in Dr. Astwood's lab that the final phases of why obesity, my career choice, came to light. I was working with thyroid in London and came back to Boston, and a man named Mo Goodman, H.M. Goodman, who became chairman of physiology at University of Massachusetts, was there as a fellow. And Mo was interested in adipose tissue, and I was interested in thyroid, so we teamed up to do some studies on the early responses to thyroid hormone in adipose tissue. And at the same time, Dr. Astwood said, I've got these interesting rats. They were given to me by Dr. Zucker. They are genetically obese, and they're a recessive trait. He said, and this is the day of the 1 gene, 1 enzyme idea, so wouldn't it be an interesting idea to try to find out more about these animals? So I began to think about that, and these forks in the road which you take, I submitted 2 grants to the NIH. One on my thyroid work and one on my genetic obesity model. And those are the days when the NIH used to actually have study sections come out and talk to you, in situ. So groups came to Boston for these grants, and we talked for our period of time. I presented my proposal and they asked me questions. Then they went back and scored them, and my boss, my mentor, Astwood, was actually on the advisory council, so he knew what the scores of my grants were. One was very good, it's top of the pack. The other was not good. so that was the final sway. The obesity one got the good marks, and the thyroid one failed to get good marks. So it was really that cemented my why obesity career, and it was in Dr. Aswood's laboratory with the Zucker rats that set me off on a career in obesity research, which I have not regretted.
What an extraordinary path.
So that's my background, but my physiology beginning, of course, went way back to Dr. Berliner's time. I think I joined the American Physiological Society probably 1960 or thereabouts, so I've been a member for a long time.
One thing that I would like for you to comment on is what kind of science curriculum did you have in high school?
The science curriculum was what most high schools had. We had math courses. I took 4 years of math because that's what you did. But the science courses, there were really only 3: biology, chemistry, and physics. And I took biology, chemistry, and physics. And didn't do any individual independent research, just what was done in the laboratories. It was a standard curriculum. Got out, passed my exams, went on to school. I did well enough in them to be exempted from the beginning courses in biology and chemistry in college. I started with the second semester. But that was the science I had before I went to college.
Did you feel that it played any role in you getting involved in biomedical research?
The curriculum probably didn't. I mean, it was really a college preparatory program. And somewhere along the way, as I said, when I went to talk to the dean about which college I would go to, I said I already thought I wanted to go to Harvard Medical School, and I had no idea what medicine was. There was nobody in the family who was a physician. But that just seemed like a good sort of thing to do. I hadn't taken any special preparation for that, but in college I was a chemistry major. But up to going to college, I didn't have any more science than most of the kids in my high school class had. And that's just what you did. We did the standard course.
One event that I know that you did not allude to is when you began collaborating with some of the people in Vermont on overfeeding studies.
Right. Well, that's after we had already established the why obesity. Once I'd reached it, the year's about 1965. That's when those two NIH committees came by and said, "Well, we like your obesity work, and forget the thyroid, sonny boy. You can do something else." So all of the things related to obesity, including the collaboration with Ethan Sims and Ed Horton and Elliot Danforth at Vermont, and Lester Salins, who actually went on to become a director of NIDDK some years later. All of those were events that happened after the why obesity event, that transition, about 1965. That's when I really began to do obesity and close the doors on all the other options.
So we will now focus on the period during which your contribution to obesity research blossomed, and also during which you made many contributions to the organization of the field, the development of publication tools, etc., because there was really very little even at the world level. Tell us about that. First, let's begin with your contribution to obesity and the kinds of activities you engaged in to basic science and clinical research.
Yeah, fine. We can start off with the research side. I was fortunate in being at Tufts and having as a couple of my first fellows, one guy named Tom Gallagher, whose father had been a very well-known biochemist at the University of Chicago. Tom was a wonderful man to work with. We published some very interesting papers on types of obesity that I'll return to in a moment. And the second was a young man named David York, who was my first PhD postdoctoral fellow. Came to join me at Tufts in 1969. and moved with me to Los Angeles when I moved a year later. So in my early years at Tufts, after obesity was where I found I was going, we began a series of studies with animals on the one hand and humans on the other. Looking at animal models, we had the Zucker fatty rat and the lean animals, and we developed a comparative obese control because you've got obese animals, you want to compare them to lean ones, you need to make, if you want to separate the genetic part, you have to have something that's obese but not genetic. So we developed hypothalamic injuries in the same strain as a comparison, so we had two obese animals and we could do pair feeding and a variety of things. We also looked at human models of obesity, particularly humans with injury to the hypothalamus who are obese. And this was where I did my studies with overfeeding with Ethan Sims. That's another model of obesity. They were overfeeding individuals, so I got to meet Ethan one time in the 60s and knew two of his colleagues, Elliot Danforth and Ed Horton, who was a classmate of mine in medical school. So we established some collaborative studies on overfeeding and with the Vermont study, as well as this comparative work with animals and humans at Tufts. So that was the framework of my research in what I'll label experimental obesity. And I guess the element, if there's a theme to it all, it's the endocrine autonomic hypothesis, which underlies, I think, and I still do think, most obesities. There's a clear-cut endocrine autonomic component that's essential. And one of the, I think, important studies we did was in these animals with hypothalamic injury that begin to eat immediately, and they have alterations in the vagus nerve, which you can cut the vagus nerve, that eating is reduced. If you transplant the islets away from where the vagus nerve would innervate and put them into the kidney capsule, that effect of hypothalamic injuries is eliminated, meaning that there's an essential connection between the brain and the periphery via the vagus nerve, and if you remove that connection to the pancreas specifically, you'll prevent the obesity. So these were the kinds of studies we were doing, comparing animal models and human models with obesity with this endocrine autonomic component. So my career in Boston after I decided why obesity, or that it was obesity, that was my calling, only lasted 3 or 4 years, and one winter I got a call and said, would I like to consider a job in Los Angeles? And so I went out to visit the facility in the Harbor UCLA Medical Center, and met Dave Solomon, who was another of my important mentors, and Bill Odell, who's head of endocrinology. And they wanted me to head their clinical research unit. And I went back to Boston, where I liked being. I loved Boston. It's a wonderful city. I enjoyed Boston, still do like Boston. Boston Red Sox fan from way back in those days when we could watch Ted Williams play. And one morning I was looking out my window in early February, and it was 10 below zero, and I'd already shoveled my driveway 3 times that winter, and another snow was coming in. And I asked myself this key question: do I want to shovel snow for the next 30 years of my life? And there was a moment's silence, and then a light went on, and it said no. And I accepted the job in Los Angeles and moved west, and love to go back to Boston in the times when there's no snow on the ground, but I can miss it when there is. So when I moved to Los Angeles, David York, who'd been my fellow in Boston, moved with me, and there was literally no gap in our research. The moving vans picked us up in Boston in August, and a week later the lab was up and running in Torrance, California. Because David was very efficient, we worked together very well. We'll come back to talk about David reappears in my career over and over. In Los Angeles, early on, I met another longtime colleague Frank Greenway, who was doing his clinical work, having graduated from UCLA Medical School, and he got interested in clinical obesity. So David was doing basic work, and Frank was doing clinical studies, which he's continued to do, and he will resurface again later in my biography too. But the early part of the 1970s, in addition to continuing the research theme of the autonomic endocrine hypothesis, which went on for that decade, and lots of elaborations of that. A second major theme developed in looking at the field, as I mentioned earlier, the influence of William Osler, the founder of the medicine at Johns Hopkins, and one of the four, they called them four horsemen, the key leaders of that school of the 1890s. His spirit still walked in the halls when I was there. And his interest in the history of medicine caught my interest. And one of the messages in all of 19th century medicine was subspecialization. That medicine didn't remain a homogeneous, everybody knows everything. It gradually split itself up into surgery, and then surgery into ophthalmology, and obstetrics, and ear, nose, and throat, and urology. Internal medicine did the same thing with endocrinology and renal disease and so on. And it was clear to me that obesity was at the stage where it needed to have a specialty structure of its own. And there was nothing, and I emphasize nothing, in the early 1970s when I was beginning my research. And so in addition to my research work, thoughts about what might be done to put a structure around those of us who were interested in obesity kept surfacing in my mind. And it sort of came to a head at a meeting I was invited to in Germany. I met a man named Alan Howard, who was from London, and he and Ian Baird had published a little monograph from an Association for the Study of Obesity meeting in London in 1968. And I'd read it. It was a wonderful thing, and I wondered why there wasn't a similar organization in the United States. And so when he was there, I asked him if we could get that together, and so we had a glass of wine on the Rhine in Bingen am Rhein, and spent about 3 hours talking about where obesity was, where it might go, and out of that, we were planning the Fogarty International Center conferences in Washington at the time. We began plans, which he carried out, for the first International Congress in London in 1974. We began talking about the need for an International Journal of Obesity, which he and I founded and became first editors for, which appeared in 1976. So the framework for international organization, for local meetings, for a journal, essentially all came to fruition in our minds, at least with a plan in mind for the next decade, in 1971, when we met in Bingen am Rhein. So this was an important event because it set in motion a variety of activities over the decade, in addition to my ongoing research activities. And they continued up to the founding of the North American Association for the Study of Obesity, which you've been president of and were, I think, present at one of the early meetings. The North American Association for the Study of Obesity was sort of patterned after the British one, British Association for the Study of Obesity, now known as the Obesity Society, and began in this country about 10 years after the British one, but again second in the world, at a meeting of the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee with John Brunzell and myself. John Brunzell's a wonderful man, a friend for years, who's a lipid researcher at the University of Washington in Seattle, a well-known scholar in science and a wonderful human being. And at the break at our nutrition committee meeting, we were out in the yard talking about fats and dietary fat and heart disease. And we got to wondering why there wasn't an obesity association in this country. Again, this is now 8 years after Alan Howard and I talked about this in Germany. And so I decided it was time to get out and do something. So I began writing letters to people who were working in obesity and got some interest in the field to, with the help of a grant from NIH for childhood obesity, with some support from the Nutrition Foundation. We put together a meeting at Vassar College in 1982. Marcy Greenwood was chair of the biology department there. She went on, as you know, to become deputy science advisor to President Clinton. She was president of the University of Hawaii, so she's had a distinguished academic career. But she was starting out in biology, and I was a little older than she was, and she and I and Wayne Calloway organized the meeting. I think we had 28 abstracts, and we had a nice group of people. This is a nice symposium, and it was our first meeting of the North American Association for the Study of Obesity. In 1983, at the International Congress, now this was the fourth International Congress. We had one that Alan Howard had started in 1973, one I'd done in, 1974, one I'd done in Washington in 1977, one that was done in Rome in 1980, and the fourth one in 1983 in New York. And that's when the formalization of NASO came about. You were at that meeting, I was there. Barbara Hansen was elected as its first president, and we went on and had a council and continued to grow from there. So it was a decade and a half of active work getting a structure to obesity nationally. And at the meeting in Jerusalem in 1986, we put together the International Association for the Study of Obesity, which was basically the last of these pillars of organizational structure.
This has been a remarkable contribution, George. One thing, though, that I would like perhaps for you to briefly review for us is the postdocs that went through your lab over these 25 years that have been involved in obesity research and have made also other contributions. Could you identify some of them?
Yes, well, thank you, Claude. Having postdoctoral fellows is one of the joys of scientific research. There have been a great many of them. I mentioned two of them already, David York and Frank Greenway, who David York began with me in 1969, went back to his main base in Southampton, was there for many years, and I ended up recruiting him to the Pennington Center, to which we will come back later. Frank Greenway was a clinician interested in obesity who went into practice after his fellowship with me and then was eventually again recruited to the Pennington Center, where he's had a superb career in obesity research. Tom Gallagher went on to become the head of endocrinology at the University of Nebraska. There were a number of Japanese fellows who have become heads of departments in Japan that were with me in the 1970s. I have to go get a long list of them. They're not on the tip of my tongue, but I would guess 3 or 4 of the university in Japan had people who come through my laboratory. Then when I moved to the West Coast, there were a large number of very good fellows that came along over the years that are working their way up into positions of importance. I guess the 2 I would mention from the Pennington Center, we're now jumping way ahead, historically would be Steve Smith and Donna Ryan, although she was already a board-certified oncologist and geriatrician at the time we met here first. I co-opted her into an obesity career where she was excellent, and I like to take credit for an outstanding person doing outstanding things in this field. Steve Smith came as a fellow and now heads his own research center in Orlando, Florida. So I've been a number of.
Now, Dr. Bray, we come to the last part of this.
Gosh, you're moving on in years, huh?
We are getting closer to your golden years. In 1989, you were appointed as Executive Director of the Pennington Biomedical Research Center. So tell us about that.
Because that's been a fascinating part of my career. So we've had about 3 25-year periods, and we've now got down to the last of those periods. It's an interesting story. I was very happy in Los Angeles. I had moved from the UCLA facility where I'd been to the University of Southern California. Both are operated in part by the County of Los Angeles, so I was a county employee in my career there. And in 1982 became Chief of Diabetes at the University of Southern California. And about 1987, I got a letter about the Pennington Biomedical Research Center. I'd heard about the gift earlier in the decade, but it sort of let it slip away because it was in Louisiana and I was in California, and that they aren't exactly next door to each other. And this letter came in, and they described this position they were recruiting for as director. They're doing a national search, and they described the size of the facility. And I said, well, I think I'll talk this one over with my department chair, because he's got a lot of experience that I'm not really interested in moving, but this sounded like an interesting possibility. So I went up to Dr. Bethune, who's chairman of medicine, and I said, Jack, I'd like to discuss whether I should apply for this job. He said yes, he'd gotten a copy of that letter as well, asking if they had any people. And he said, it's a very unusual position. He said, you have a 10,000 square foot laboratory in the lower floor of this 4th-story building. The building's shaped like an H, so there's 40,000 square feet in one part of the H and 40,000 in the other, so it's 80,000 in the total building. He said, they're offering you the equivalent of 3 of those buildings if you go to Baton Rouge. And they're offering you a few $1 million to operate it. He said, that's a very unusual setting. He said, I would encourage you to go take a look at it. So in early 1988, I came down to New Orleans, and I think Dr. Ryan picked me up, and I met the people in New Orleans at the medical center, because at that time, the anticipated structure was that the Pennington Center would be a division of the medical center in New Orleans, and I would be a vice chancellor under Perry Rigby, who was chancellor, along with the other chancellors, vice chancellors for the dental school, the medical school, and the allied health. So this would be just another unit of the medical center. So I met with them, then came up to Baton Rouge and met with Mr. Pennington, who's a fascinating man, an oil man whose story is just priceless. It's sort of the thing of legend. He started wildcatting when he got out of college. He was an optometrist, but didn't practice very long. Made his first big oil strike worth $100 million when he was 1972, when he was 72 years old. So there's still hope for us, Claude. We gotta keep hoping. Then in 1979, he guessed for his outcome that there might be gas and oil in the Hudson Trend just north of Baton Rouge, and I think it was with Texaco. They agreed to drill together, and he ended up with finds worth $1 billion. So he was the first billionaire in Louisiana and one of the few billionaires in the country. And he wanted to give money away because he didn't want to pay taxes on $1 billion. That's a lot of taxes. So he let it be known he was going to give donations, and the people were coming in and saying, we'd like to do this, that, or the other. President of the university came in, Dr. Copping, and noted that on the windowsill, in Louisiana we have low windowsills, so they're not high like they are most of the country, they're down low for better ventilation. That there were some bottles along the windowsill And when they got up to take a break, he went and looked at some of them with vitamin C and vitamin B12, and vitamin E. And so when they came back from the break, Dr. Copping, the president of the university, said, "You know, Mr. Pennington, what LSU needs is a nutrition research center." And Mr. Pennington stood up and said, "You got your $100 million, just like that." Well, it turned out to be $125 million in 1980 when the gift was all done. They built this 250,000 square feet of space on what was then the old experimental farm for the university. And in 1987, they were beginning to try to find a director because there was this building sitting out there costing a lot of money, $1 million a year to heat and light and cool and so on. So that's the setting to which I came in 1988. And gradually over the course of the year, we agreed I would come, and I was driving down the freeway the Friday after Thanksgiving. As you may know, the university is run by a group of supervisors. They have to approve all high-level appointments. So apparently they had met that Friday, which they usually do the last Friday of the month, and had approved my appointment as director. I was driving down the freeway of Los Angeles, and the local NBC station, which I listened to, came on the radio and said, "Dr. George Bray has been appointed director of Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana," which is quite a surprise driving down the road in Los Angeles. So I was due for my sabbatical at the beginning of 1989 and went to England, took my sabbatical, was there in David York's lab because we started together and we worked periodically together since then. And he was kind of interested in moving. Things were a little sluggish. So we talked him into coming to look at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center. And he came in the spring of 1989, and when I became director, he was the first appointment. And he moved to Baton Rouge in late 1989. I moved in August of 89. And that beginning 6 months, appointing David, who then arrived, appointing Dr. Donna Ryan as the Associate Executive Director for Clinical Research, Bill Sylvia, who's a wonderful accountant who, instead of saying you can't do it, says how do we do it? How do we solve financial issues? So with that team in place, we began to move ahead to recruit people. We had a large building, 25 people in nearly 250,000 square feet, 10,000 square feet each. That's like my whole laboratory space in Los Angeles with only one person. So there were lots of space. We had lots of money because they've been very generous in their startup package for me, which made it possible for me to help others. So our real challenge was recruitment, and which had been one of the challenges when I decided to come. Could you really recruit bright, young, active people to come to Baton Rouge to begin their careers, or in mid-career, and more important, that senior level people? So we began to recruit fellows, and it became pretty clear we could get bright young people who were beginning their careers. We got David West and Jennifer Lovejoy, who became president of the Obesity Society, and Steve Smith, who was finishing a fellowship and now is president of the Obesity Society. So we were able to get some very bright young people to move here. The real challenge was to get more senior people, and we gradually began to increase our program, and we were helped a great deal by NIH deciding to double its size between about 1992 and 2002. That meant NIH had a lot of money they needed to dispose of, and one of the ways in which you spend money productively is to do big projects. So they put out RFAs for a number of them, which we began to apply for. One was in dietary patterns for lipids, and we became part of a group of 4 institutions: Columbia, Minnesota, Penn State, and in a project called the Delta one, which looked at dietary lipids and atherosclerosis. The second of these was dietary patterns and blood pressure, a consortium where among the 80 applicants, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Duke, and Pennington Center were selected to look at dietary patterns, and that study ended up with what's called the DASH diet, which is a high fruits and vegetables, high diet with low-fat dairy products to get calcium, magnesium, potassium, and we effectively lowered blood pressure. Then the third of these big projects was the diabetes prevention program, which began in 1994 with 2 years of planning, recruiting in 96 to 99, and we're now in our 21st year of that project. So these were major programs which came along and gave us the structural base for both a strong clinical and a strong basic science program. We recruited Dr. Frank Greenway, who I mentioned earlier as one of my first clinical fellows, to come head the clinical group as it was growing. Dr. Ryan was magnificent in running the clinical activities, and I was able to work with David York a great deal to continue my basic science grants and my merit award, which had been given to me by NIH for 10 years, so I didn't have to go back every 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 years. That's a big asset. So that was a very productive period. The only other element which came along in that time was the founding of Obesity Research. We already talked about the International Journal, and as is clear in science, it grows exponentially. And when I started back at Tufts, which we mentioned, there were no journals in obesity field. We founded the first one was the International Journal. The second one was one in surgery. Then it was clear that a North American-based journal was needed. So I approached the Obesity Obesity Society about doing this, and with their concurrence, we started Obesity Research, which was published in 1993, and I was editor for the first 5 years. So we now had a third journal in the field, and by last count, I think we're up to about 15. So like most fields, there's an exponential growth in numbers of journals, just as there are in scientists, which is why way back in the beginning of my career, it was clear we needed some structure, and that structure has sort of continued to evolve as we've gone on. So my time at the Pennington Center has allowed me to do both my basic and to switch to a clinical research structure, which I've continued on after I turned the directorship over to you in 1999 after 10 years. The other person I was very fortunate actually to have recruited along the way, I'll mention. One of the ways you learn about whether you're doing a job well is to get outside advisors to come in and say, well, you could do that better, or you're really doing that well. So one of the first things I did after recruiting David York and Donna Ryan was to establish an external advisory committee of about 10 first-class scientists from around the country. Most of them were members of the National Academy of Sciences or Institute of Medicine. And in that group, I think you were either in the first group or the second group of such people who came in on an every other year basis to see how we were doing. And I'm sure you will agree that we came from not doing much to doing a great deal in a fairly short period of time at the Pennington Center, with the grants I've described and the support it had and the recruitment of young and people had done well. But I think that was a key element. It brought you into the scene, and when I was ready to retire in 1999 back into my academic career, I was pleased you were selected as director of the Pennington Biomedical Research Center.
Another journey that is remarkable, George. Before we close, could you tell us at the moment what are the scientific questions that are of great interest to you that you're pursuing?
Well, I think the one that I stew about is why the discovery of leptin in 1994 this peptide in adipose tissue, which the peptide or its receptor deficiency led to the obesities I was studying from the very beginning of my career, why that hasn't turned into anything clinically useful. It's clearly biologically a very important molecule, but certainly treatment with that molecule, unless you don't have any, is not very useful. You don't lose weight with raising leptin because obese people have excess leptin. So the challenge is why that system hasn't been turned into productive output for people. The translation, the basic science is there, but nobody has yet come up with what's required to translate that understanding into. And I sort of struggle with this issue from time to time, why our therapeutic strategies have not kept up with our underlying understanding of mechanisms, which advanced dramatically from the beginning of my career to the present. We can describe the whole modulatory system for weight and fat regulation, visceral fat formation, much more effectively. But the translation of that knowledge into value for people has lagged way behind. So I think that's where I spend my time thinking about how I would solve that problem if I had the money, the time to do it.
That brings us to the end of this interview. Thank you very much, George, for a really nice interview, very informative.
Thank you, Claude. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
We congratulate you on this very successful career of yours, and I wish you personally many more years of joy in science and also in mentoring young investigators and young colleagues here at the center. Thanks again for your contribution to the American Physiological Society.
It's been a pleasure to be a member of that society for the past 50-some years.